Good morning, everybody. Okay. Power helps. Welcome back to our WELS 175th anniversary Bible study. Today we're going to be looking at perseverance in the face of many challenges. The last couple of lessons we've seen how God had blessed, and even through this He's going to continue to bless our synod. But we're going to have a season of challenges on a number of different fronts we'll see today. The picture that is slowly panning in front of you is from the dedication of the New Thiensville Seminary in 1929. All the churches in Milwaukee canceled worship that day, and there's an estimated 15,000 WELS Lutherans gathered together to dedicate. They had 2 sermons that day, so wow, 2 sermons in one service, so that's... And they had a 500-voice choir as well. So, an incredible day. So, like I said, in the face of challenges, God also pours out incredible blessing. Let's begin with a prayer. Lord God Almighty, you are our shelter in the storm and tempests of life. You give your church times of want and also times of prosperity, times of calm and also challenges. And you do these things so that you might drive us closer to you, drive us to your word of truth. Continue to guide your church through every age for the good of the gospel and the growth of your kingdom. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. At the end of our last lesson, we saw that our synod elected a new president. He was elected in 1908, Gustav Bergman. He was very influential in the transition from federated synods to a merged synod. So, do anyone remember from last time what were the 4 different synods that were coming together in a federation? Michigan, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Minnesota. All right. So they started a federation last time. They started working together, and under Bergman's leadership, they're going to merge to form what we know of now as more the Wisconsin Synod. Moldenhauser founded the Wisconsin Synod. Bodding shaped its confessional stance. Bergman was the one who gave it its organizational form. He encountered in the 1920s strains of rugged individualism which resisted the newly established structures of synod and seminary alike. So, sometimes we think there are new ideas under the sun. We still have, people that think this way today, that, organized religion and things being too centralized are automatically evil and bad. We encounter that yet now. He faced the challenges that we're going to spend much of our lesson looking at today of the Protestant Controversy, and also the worst of the Great Depression. Looking now at the merger of the different synods, in 1917, the Joint Synod resolved to merge into a more centralized institution. The new constitution called for Minnesota, Michigan, Nebraska synods to become districts of the newly merged synod. Wisconsin synod was divided then into 3 districts. So it started to didn't look like this quite then, but started to look something like the different districts that we know of today. So you've got, 3 districts of Wisconsin. And the reason why Wisconsin was so divided was just because to even out the balance of how many churches there were and number of plain WELS members in relative areas. So that's our current map nowadays. That's what we'll be going towards over time. The Pacific Northwest District, in 1884, Pastor Frederick Wolf organized the German Lutherans in Tacoma, Washington. They joined the Wisconsin Synod in 1894. They were the first major field of Wisconsin Synod home missions outside of the Midwest. We see that now. We see that continue into the 60s and 70s where, WELS starts to go outside. I'll say it's Midwest home base and start to establish congregations in other areas. They did organize as a district in 1918. Sorry, I'll just say every number that I can, and eventually one of them will be correct. In 1918, with the restructuring of the Wisconsin Synod merger. Looking at the Dakota-Montana district, remember that mission work had been begun there by the Minnesota Synod in the 1880s. They had been very influential in forming not only new missions, but sending pastors out as circuit riders in that area. Large numbers of Lutheran immigrants and pioneers settled in the region after the 1909 Homestead Act. And in 1920, 23 pastors and 6 delegates formed the Dakota-Montana district. One of the biggest major challenges that came next was World War I and how that ended up affecting Lutheran German Americans. There were frequent acts of mob violence against Germans. The picture you have here is of a German farmer, John Meintz of Minnesota. He was tarred and feathered in 1918 for allegedly not supporting war bond drives. Lutheran churches and schools were often painted yellow. Some were even burned down. One WELS teacher, it said, was shot at while teaching students. With them, Germany and all things German were seen as evil and had to fight against German expansion in Europe. Lutherans resisted preaching the war as a crusade against evil, as many other denominations did. So the government at this time takes and puts pressure on the churches to say, hey, we're engaged in this great conflict in Europe. Make sure that you are, from the pulpit, saying the correct things about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are.
I know there was a lot of trouble in World War I and World War II.
Yes, we are going to get into that. 6 WELS pastors were placed in custody for private anti-war sentiments. So while our pastors did not take and toe the official line of, America is doing everything well and Germany is all bad in this conflict, what reservations they had, they did express in private and not from the pulpit. And they did so for, conscience's sake. Many Wisconsin Synod Lutherans had been either born in Germany or were only a generation or two removed. They had stayed connected with friends and relatives in Germany. They could naturally sympathize with the situation. Many were concerned about the press bias and the draft. You can imagine that if all of a sudden, you're drafted and your kids are drafted and they have to go back home and fight against their cousins or something like that. Much like we can think of even the Civil War, right? Where, you have people even within the same family fighting one another. What a sad and ugly situation that could be.
It goes all the way back to the Revolution when many Lutherans didn't feel they could rebel against the government put over them.
Mm-hmm. And we should note that, it's always wrong to go against one's conscience. So that's something that we have when it comes to things like war and, being a soldier and other things like that. We definitely want to generally support the government, especially if it's in a defensive war or a war where we are stepping in to help a side that's obviously being oppressed or aggressed against, to help restore peace. But in the end, it comes down to each Christian's conscience, and if a Christian says in good conscience, I can't support this, then we have to leave that up to them, and they have to bear whatever consequences might fall and be willing to bear whatever consequences might happen because of that. At the same time, especially those who are leaders in the church need to be careful that they don't make feelings that are of their conscience something that they then put upon others. So they can say, hey, I don't personally feel comfortable with this, therefore maybe you shouldn't either, and if you do, you're wrong, or any number of things like that. One case of this would be Adolf Ackerman from DMLC. He did join with civic leaders in New Ulm to voice some of these concerns. It ended up as a result that he and others were forced to resign, but this did renew that discussion about, okay, what are the roles of church and state, and make sure that we keep those things separate. There were plenty of WELS Lutherans that did volunteer to go and fight in the war. We have an example here of Delmer Steinhorst. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. WELS worked with Synodical Conference to create the Lutheran Church Board for Army and Navy to support the troops' spiritual needs. This young man, the third-generation German-American and WELS member, he was drafted but did not resent his service. His postcard he sent home, he often wrote, "Am fine and dandy." After the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. After the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, the German defeat forced them to concede large sections of their territory. It created the new nation of Poland, which meant that many German Lutherans were now in a, so to speak, foreign country, cut off from their traditional sources of spiritual support. As a result, in 1923, the Wisconsin began funding mission work among Germans in Poland and supporting the Lutheran Free Church in Poland. So remember, once again, Free Church, as opposed to the state church that had been a result of the Prussian Union, how they had forced all Protestants, if you will, to lump together. So there was only Catholic and Protestants were the only allowed religions in the territory. But free churches were then able to exist, but they had to support themselves. This mission work among the Germans in Poland continued until the Soviet forces overran Germany in January of 1945. During this time, the Synod also started to produce a bilingual catechism, which was used until 1956. They also started to publish the Northwestern Lutheran in English, but it wouldn't be until 1939 that the English version would outsell the German version. I did also notice here, too, that apparently Germans require a much fancier font than English reading people. So, what? I guess so. So apparently we English speakers don't get the fancy calligraphy. We just need plain typed letters. What did many Wisconsin Lutherans dislike about the U.S. involvement in World War I? To review. Wait, give me something?
It was seen as a crusade against people.
Okay, so, they questioned the narrative that was being put through the media in terms of, this is all Germany's fault and Germany is the aggressor. There was some things that Germany did. They gave an unconditional blank check to Austria to fight Serbia after Franz Ferdinand was killed. So there were some things they did in that one couldn't say, hey, they kind of opened themselves up to what ended up happening. Any other things?
There was a lot of inflammatory propaganda used in war advertising, like the Germans are killing babies to make grease for the Kaiser's war machine, things like that.
Okay, so yes, when you have things like that, and then what does that do? That translates then to discrimination, and like we saw, some churches being burned down, a person being literally tarred and feathered, and that sort of thing. So we can understand that Lutherans weren't exactly thrilled about that. Yes?
There's backstory too with the, like, Kaiser, the King of England at that time, and Nicholas in Russia. They were all first cousins.
Mm-hmm.
Their grandmother was Queen Victoria, and she married off her daughters to this family and that family. And one said to the other, "What would Granny say if she knew what this was going on?" But they were all first cousins.
Sometimes fights within the family can be just as ugly as anything else. And of course, then the Wisconsin Synod Germans were also, many of them, uncomfortable with the thought of perhaps going back and fighting their relatives or friends, from back home, so to speak. And they resisted the government's attempt to unduly influence preaching from the pulpit. What impact did World War I have on the Wisconsin Synod?
A lot of churches switched to English in their service.
Okay, so that catechism that we saw that was German and English resulted from this. You had it where churches, feeling the social pressure, I think some took and said, all right, let's be American and at least give an English option when it comes to worship and publications and so on.
But that didn't remove it completely. As I told you last week, my dad, when we were in Iron Ridge, Wisconsin, once a month, he had to have a German service once a month.
Yep, so German is still a strong part of our heritage. I remember growing up, even though I did not speak German, on Christmas Eve, we still had to do Silent Night in verse 1 in German, right? So, many WELS members did faithfully serve our country in the war, gave their lives for our country. And also, remember at the end of last time, we talked about how when World War I happened, pretty much the flow of German immigration came to practically a dead stop. There had been millions of German immigrants that had come in the 60 years, before that, 75 years before then, and now that almost came to a dead stop. So suddenly then, WELS had to look at, well, okay, if we don't have this source of people that we can evangelize to, how can we better evangelize in English? How can we start to look, outside ourselves for those who need to hear the gospel? And now we're going to look at what's called the Protestant Controversy. There's really three things that are not directly related, but kind of all happened in the same time frame that ended up causing a great amount of turbulence within our synod. One thing that happened was at Northwestern College. It was discovered in 1924 that 27 students were involved in a thieving ring. They had been shoplifting from local stores. The faculty expelled 7 of the most serious cases and punished the rest. However, it caused extra controversy in that the school statutes only gave the board the right to expel students and not the faculty. So as a result, 3 faculty members resigned. It caused a stir in the synod. Supporters of the faculty began to meet and protest the board's actions. That's what happened, I guess, in all 3 of these cases in a way, is that you end up getting where this is the next person in the chain of command, I'll say, but then other people act, and you end up getting tensions and controversy that way. Not necessarily controversy about, hey, what was right and wrong here, but more structure and is the order of things being followed well, and are people being treated fairly? Yes?
27 students. I mean, I've seen pictures of graduating classes, and that's almost a whole class.
Picture at school, entire school.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think that they were all from one class. I think it was spread across multiple grade levels, if you want to call it that. Looking at Fort Atkinson, what happened there. In 1924, two young teachers, Miss Greta Kuck and Miss Elizabeth Reuter, they were upset and frustrated that their pastor failed, at least in their eyes, to support their classroom discipline and adequately to preach against the culture of the Roaring Twenties, such as short dresses, dance music in church, bobbed haircuts. They complained that it seemed like the young people were more interested in social activities than studying the Bible. With some of these things, one could argue, again, have things really changed in the sense of, young people are always going to be young people, and they're going to want to socialize, and maybe not everyone's going to be, hey, gung-ho about Bible study. We just want to have fun together or something like that. And they also had all kinds of other minor circumstances that they then made into not just matters of opinion, but matters of strict right and wrong. In the end, they accused their pastor of being a false prophet. They refused to attend worship. They encouraged others to do the same thing. They were then placed under church discipline, and while they were under church discipline, they both took calls to Marshfield, Wisconsin, and they did so before the congregation could adequately address the situation, which you can understand angered the home congregation. So it would be like, still today, if someone's under church discipline, you don't transfer someone's membership to another WELS church when they're under church discipline until that's been resolved. And so what happened was these two young ladies went to Marshfield. They talked to the pastor and the principal there. They were satisfied with their side, these young ladies' side of the story. They ended up calling them. So then, essentially, before anything could be rectified, they are now gone. The church at St. Paul's was upset about what happened because these women pretty much disappeared before they could properly follow Matthew 18, and there was much back and forth between the two. The Western Wisconsin District then ended up suspending the teachers from eligibility for calls. So, if you will, instead of having the teachers go back, and I'm going to say face a situation where they were, the district came in and said, we're now suspending these teachers from getting calls anywhere. That then caused people to protest, not that they necessarily agreed with what the teachers were saying, but because they didn't like it that the home congregation wasn't allowed to handle the situation and the district hadn't stepped in. Yes?
How was it that they were even, I would think, even today, now when I went back into teaching, I had to get the okay from not one, but two district presidents before I could accept the call, or even get a call. How was it that they were allowed to do, I know the congregation did it, but did they not consult with the district?
I apologize. I don't have that depth of details on this situation, so I apologize. I don't know what exactly the answer is. I mean, it could be that the very reason why, you went through those things was because of situations like this, where maybe they're like, hey, we have to make sure that these things are communicated and followed through at the district level. Otherwise, you can have it where one church is calling someone and messes like this can happen. So again, there's controversy because of this. Some people protested and left because of it. Some congregations left and called workers left as well. In defense of the district, I think one can see their point of view in that the situation had gotten much bigger than just someone's under church discipline in one congregation. Hey, we got to iron that out. It had now become there are other people, there's other pastors and principals on their side. There's people who are considering leaving. So it's like all these things are going to end up being. There's going to be a quote later on by President Kaler about a different situation, but he's going to say it's a mess. And that's, I think, kind of what you can say this situation ended up being too, was a regrettable mess. Continued around the same time period, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name right. Is it Bites? Bites? Okay, thank you. I got someone who knows some German out there shaking his head and saying, yes, all right, I'll take it. In 1926, Pastor Bites delivered a paper at the Pastors' Conference of St. Peter's in Schofield, Wisconsin, the church where my wife Christy is from. I'm from Wausau, which is right next to Schofield. So that's not where Pastor Bites was from. He was from Rice Lake, Wisconsin, but that's where this paper was delivered. In the paper, he criticized an attitude among Christians in the Wisconsin Synod that took comfort in knowing the right doctrine without living it, and he called for repentance. He said things like, our danger is ever to lose the spirit and then to boil down our Christian life to the observance of certain things, works, an intellectual assenting to a certain number of things learned perhaps in our catechism course. He said, now the devil has not gone to us to deny the divinity of Jesus and doctrine, but you may be sure that he is after us in some way. We assent to his divinity, but isn't it, like our whole professed Christianity, mostly head matter? Is it not a life by faith? Very much we stress a life by works. Not having a spirit, the life by faith, we have an imitation of it. We add and substitute forms, rituals, laws, constitutions, organizations, ceremony, institutions, rules, regulations, systems, outlines, programs, externals, observances of certain things, dogmas, and so on. Not having the power of godliness, we stress the forms. We have a head knowledge of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God, but our heart is far from it, so that we deny the Christ as the Savior from sins in words or in power. We can get a sense by how he writes that he was, I'm going to say, a very forceful, charismatic individual. He wrote in ways that were interesting and powerful. He says, shame on us, we call ourselves Lutheran, and again, it is only a form, an empty word, for in fact, we are not. So Bites called on pastors and for all Christians to read the Bible first for their own lives, to live it, and then to share it. I think that's something that, at least in summary form, we can all agree on. The question then kind of became, was he judging hearts or raising valid concerns? I mean, how easily this can happen to any of us, right? Where we take and say, I'm not going to say so often, in my own heart even, self-righteousness can rise up and you can look at someone and say, well, I'm doing this thing, but because they're not doing this thing, well, maybe their faith's not just quite as strong, or maybe they're not really living it the way that they should, or, that spirit can so easily rise up in any of us to take and say, are people just doing things in their head, or are they really, really His passionate tone stoked a sense of controversy, which appealed to some and disturbed others. Could he have said these things in a gentler fashion, the same concerns? Yes. He also took and talked about things like spiritual lethargy in the seminary and among professors and things like that, which of course then, not saying that it maybe wasn't there, but that appeals to some, right, who want to take and say, yes, down with the establishment, down with old ways and old ways of thinking and tradition. We got to take and re-spiritualize ourselves. And in other words, he wasn't someone, and his divisive way of communicating wasn't a way that took and soothed the situation and soothed the discontent out. Instead, it only heightened it and created, polarization. His paper was quickly circulated and read at other conferences and gatherings. So he read it in Schofield first. It caused quite a stir there, and it was then being copied and disseminated and being read in many places. After that point, then, the seminary faculty felt, well, someone has to respond to this in a formal opinion, at least in some way, to either say, yes, he has some valid points about, perhaps we're drifting towards formalism and externals and doctrine of the mind rather than, Christian life lived out in spirit, in the heart, and in word and action. So they felt that it had to be addressed, at least in some official way. The reaction to the Bites paper. 3 seminary faculty, Piper, Mayer, and Hinkle, conferred for an opinion. It was primarily written by Professor Piper, and it was signed by all the seminary faculty, including President Kaler. President Kaler, though, had his reservations. What he thought should have been the next thing that was done before this rebuttal or opinion was ever put out there was that they should talk to Bites personally to get his point of view. And what did he really mean by what you wrote? I think we can all have had it where a text message maybe or an email that we've sent or a paper that we've written has been misconstrued by somebody. Perhaps we use strong language in it, or maybe they read something into it that wasn't actually there. So isn't it always wise to sit down with someone else and say, hey, this is how I took to mean what you wrote or said. And they might say, well, no, that's not at all what I meant. I didn't mean it to be that way. And then you can work things out. So that's what Kaler wanted to happen. Unfortunately, this opinion was published before that whole process could happen and be worked out. On the other side, in defense of Piper, Mayer, and Hinkle and the publishing of this opinion, kind of like the Protestant controversy with the teachers, this is one of those things that had also gotten bigger. Okay, it's being read at not just that local conference, but now many conferences. It's involving many pastors. They felt that an answer had to be given. Otherwise, if you say nothing, or the longer that you say nothing, then it seems like we agree with everything that this gentleman, this pastor, is saying. And then that can also cause confusion. I just want to make sure I have my details straight here. Kaler did go to visit Bites to seek, he says, to understand our opponent, not as his words can or even must be understood, but how he wants them to be understood. After that meeting with Bites, Kaler formally removed his support from the opinion that was written. It doesn't mean that Kaler agreed with Bites, but he didn't necessarily like how the process was being carried out once again, that this man didn't have an opportunity to, Kaler felt, adequately defend himself. So the opinion was published. The Wisconsin Synod District President, instead of taking and giving Bites an opportunity to talk about it back, say, within the conference or something like that, or among those pastors, all that he did was he published the seminary's opinion and pushed it out, printed it out, and pushed it out to all the district pastors and said, this is now our official stance on this. So that was not handled very well either. As J.P. Kaler said, this is a mess. Now you have where, as very often happens, once people start putting back and forth in writing, then you have it where you say, I got to stand by what I said, maybe even sometimes when you shouldn't.
Finally, I remember hearing as a kid, especially on my mother's side of the family, they were arguing all the time about the Protestants, this and the Protestants that. I would have had it been this because the other two didn't make sense. It had been this because but it was in my mother's family, and well, she's got pastors and as brothers, and her fathers. But now, finally, I understand.
Starting to make a little bit of sense as to what are they wrangling about, right? A special meeting of the Western Wisconsin District was called for in Watertown in 1927. They officially rejected the Bites paper. They resolved that all who subscribed to it would thereby have broken the bond of fellowship, and they considered the suspension cases of several dissenting pastors. It was, as some said, a tumultuous scene as the Protestants attempted to voice their grievances. They said that they weren't given a chance to speak, that Piper was kind of dominating the discussion, as they even described it with his theatrics, as they called them. So then it still wasn't really dealt with, and they said, all right, let's make a committee of 12 to handle the situation. So they formed a special committee and to try to bring the sides together. The committee had made every effort to meet with the people in question, had written invitations to them in which it was asked, yes, begged, in the most brotherly, Christian, and earnest manner to submit their cases in writing and also to appear in person before said committee, but the matter could be fully and calmly deliberated upon in a spirit of brotherly love and, if possible, settled in a God-pleasing manner. Yet the repeated and sincere endeavors were not only unsuccessful, but were treated with insult and abuse. There was a German version of this on the PowerPoint that I deleted because I didn't want to take or maybe it was Latin, so I didn't want to try to take and put it up there for you. So the English version of it, as this controversy continued, Piper from the seminary kind of said, you can either come round or get out. It wasn't very difficult for the Protestants to find much in Piper's attitude and the very stark way in which he dealt, black and white way in which he dealt with this, to see him as kind of being, I'll say, the enemy. Yes?
Was the nature of the rejection of his paper that they didn't like that, like you were just saying, that he was taking such a black and white attitude toward it? Or was it they wanted to keep the formalism in there? It seems like the things he's suggesting are not terrible to look inside oneself yet. So
the main controversy in all this was not necessarily that everything that Bites said was wrong. Okay? The main controversy was how it ended up being handled, and that Piper was very black and white about the situation and would not, up to this point, give Bites a chance to explain himself. And rather just said, hey, if you don't agree with what we've said, you're out. It should be noted again that, that Kaler didn't necessarily support the Bites paper. It was a matter of how it was being dealt with. He twice visited with Bites personally to try to understand what he intended in his essay. However, Bites is not totally off the hook in this either. When he refused to withdraw what he had written or in any way clarify his paper, Kaler held him half responsible for the controversy. So, as much as, again, Piper's very strict black and white attitude on this whole situation did not make it easy to work with, Bites at the same time didn't necessarily come and say, hey, let me take and talk about what my paper said. He pretty much said, there's my paper, you can take it or leave it. Okay, so lessons to be learned, for us from the past going forward. Yes?
Another couple hard-headed Germans.
Yes, we got that too, right? Kaler, as a result, was dismissed from the seminary faculty as the president of the seminary faculty. He later went to live with his son, Karl, who was pastor of a Protestant congregation in Nielsville. In 1933, the Synod Convention actually had to suspend Kaler's membership in the Synod because then he was part of a church that was not in fellowship with the Synod. So, an ugly situation. They have spoken their own verdict. They have gone out from us because they have a different spirit, is what the Committee of the 12 ended up saying in 1928. When it comes to the Protestant controversy in the 1920s and 30s, over 40 pastors, professors, seminary students left or were removed from the Wisconsin Synod and joined the Protestant Conference. Over 24 congregations left the Synod, and we lost about twice as many called workers than congregations. All right, if we were going to summarize what the Protestant controversy was all about, what things might we all put together?
The first part of the school teachers sounds kind of like pietism.
Yes, to a degree. Yep, there's the, and what pietism is that theological movement that takes and says you have to feel. It's very much based in feeling, emotion, that you have to feel in the Spirit, you have to pray fervently enough and feel that God has answered your prayers and wrestle with Him on an emotive level and do that thoroughly enough, and then you can be assured that you have faith and so on.
Might there be a little legalism mixed in there too?
Legalism, yep. I mean, to take in and say, hey, this is just what it is, and we're not going to even sit down and let's discuss it, And I'm not saying that people are not who's right and wrong, but let's at least sit down and discuss this through in a way that's peaceable and open. I think we also saw in all three of these cases where I think one can understand both sides of the issue, where people from higher up in the Synod organization took and said, hey, we have to address the situation, and people on maybe the local level said, hey, we want to address it, So you have that in all three of these cases where there's missteps and miscommunication and I'm gonna say one layer of oversight not liking the other layer, and yeah.
Not following Matthew 18, basically.
Yeah, but like I said, I think one can also see in all these situations that things had gotten way bigger than just, hey, this is about our congregation, that it had gone suddenly much bigger. Yes?
I'm a little confused. You mentioned a Protestant congregation. What did they believe or support?
I think they're going towards the like Glenn said, the pietism side of things, more of the emphasizing, as one should, emphasizing the living out one's faith and being sincere about it, not taking and just believing based on, okay, this is what my parents said or my grandparents said, or this is what the doctrine is that's stated.
Would they have necessarily supported one of those two papers?
Some of them may have. I mean, some of them may have supported the Bites paper, but again, a lot of it was also people were angry about how it was done. So I guess I don't pretend to know whether they were, I'm going to say, theologically on the side of that, or if it was more, we're upset about this organizational structure and how it played out, or it could have been a combination of those in many situations. And you had your hand raised.
Are the key players mostly in Wisconsin at this point, like Wisconsin State at this point? Like, are they within range of being able to talk to each other, or are they spread out?
The Protestant
No,
group?
the key players in all of this, like obviously the people at the seminary were at the seminary, and the key players in all of these discussions, were they close enough that they could talk to each other, or is this done through like?
At that time.
Yeah. I was just curious, like.
I think the way that this ends up being, I think it ends up being almost more of like a cascade of a collection of things that happen, and then they find like a common, we're not happy. Like as can happen where like discontents of a thing can take and say, well, we don't necessarily maybe all agree precisely on what made us discontent, but we're discontent.
What I'm saying is you don't have, a couple of these people weren't out in the Pacific Northwest, and a couple weren't in southwestern Minnesota, and a couple weren't in Milwaukee. Like, they're mostly, it seems to me that most of those people are kind of in the Milwaukee area, so they can sit and talk to each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the question. Yeah, that's what she's asking. Could they meet face to face, or was it physically impossible for them?
I don't think it was physically impossible. I don't think it was physically impossible. I think that it was more their own stubbornness that took and had them decide and choose not to meet.
It's almost like they danced around it. Both sides danced around it. And if that happened, that picture is accurate. It looks like they were congregations also in Michigan and Minnesota,
Yep.
maybe South Dakota too. So it was just all over. And that, as I said before, it explains a lot of the discussion in my mom's family.
Messy. Yes.
I guess the other thing is, it seems like these issues they were having were a reaction to things that were going on in society and with, the government. And so their reaction wasn't, it was kind of divided, and their way of resolving it got involved in it. So that wasn't all thought out, maybe didn't get discussed, sort of an undercurrent, because the teacher's problem was with the society and how it was influencing the church. So it's almost like it's more like like it is today.
And that was Bites' point of view too, right? I mean, his was also a spiritual revival, I'll say. So.
They didn't know how they were going to resolve those larger societal issues with the society going one way and the church going the other way. And so, and Germany versus, German Americans, and how they felt about going to war against their brothers, that all mixed in with it. How do we make all those adjustments? And so it's like they did kind of fumble the ball. They were attacking each other instead of getting together and going, how do we feel about this? How the government's
I think that's all the things that you mentioned there are things that we have to ongo. I think this kind of event showed we have to keep on wrestling with these things and never be content just taking and resting at a certain point. Very quickly, the new seminary, well, the next part also talks about debt. I will wait till next time to take and bring up the closure of our lesson. There's also a section here on synod debt when it comes to the Great Depression. So, yes, closing remarks for this part so far.
When did Thiensville become Mequon? Or because right now, I thought it was the same place, it all been dealt with as the same place.
There was a time there when Mequon, took over that part of, like appropriated, yeah. Right. I'm not sure what the exact date on and what the city politics was there. All right, so next time we'll wrap up this section looking at another challenge that our synod faced when it came to finances during the Great Depression. Stay happy. We'll see you then.